So in today's lesson, I want to talk about the components of blood. And this is a topic that you should be somewhat familiar with, either from remembering what you learned in grade 10 science, or just sort of in existing in this world, interacting with other people in various conversations. So let's take a look at it. So you'll notice here that I have a Google Maps little screenshot of the distance from Bracebridge to Miami. So just kind of put that aside for now. I'm going to get back to it. So first of all, let me mention that the average human has about 5 liters of blood. And if you need to conceptualize that, 1 cup is about 250 milliliters. So just your regular, measuring cup. And so a liter will have 4 cups to it. So 4 times 5 tells you have about 20 cups of blood. So if you need to know, that's a visual of what, is around about the amount of blood you have in your body. Now, this may surprise you if you were to look at the amount of blood circulating in your body. And it's a closed system that we have. And so if we were to take end to end all of those blood vessels and measure them out, it would add up to about 96,000 kilometers of blood vessels. And so back to my Google map here, because what I've depicted is the distance from Bracebridge to Miami, and it's about 2,563 kilometers. So I figured, well, let's analyze that a bit to get, a bit of an idea about how far 96,000 kilometers are. Round trip would be double that, obviously. So if we were to take that 96,000 and divide it into the round trip distance to Miami from Bracebridge, that would give us about 18.7. So, well, what does that mean? And by the way, you don't need to remember any of this. It's just for interest's sake. That means we could take a round trip. We could take almost 19 round trips from Bracebridge to Miami in the amount of distance. That's how much distance our blood vessels would be able to travel. So that, I don't know about you, but that is pretty amazing to me. So onward we move. I want you to take a look at this diagram, and I want you to think about it's, obviously divided into different subsections here. And we can see that the majority of this blood sample is composed of this yellowy liquid. There's a small amount here, and then here's this red liquid. Now we should mention that, when blood comes out of your body, if you've ever gone for, a blood test, then you know that all of these are sort of mixed. We don't see any distinction between layers. And so what has to happen with your blood sample is it usually gets centrifuged. And centrifugation, we actually have a machine, a centrifuge at our school, which I would happily show you when we return. That basically it just spins really quickly and all the heavier items move to the bottom and the lighter items sort of remain on top, but it allows us to separate based on mass different components of a particular sample. And so that is what will happen to a blood sample should it go to the lab. But what are these components? Let's see how many of the components of blood you could remember. So we have plasma, white blood cells and platelets, and red blood cells. So I'm guessing you probably got maybe 2 or 3 out of 4. Congrats to you if you got all 4. But let's just talk briefly about all of them. So here's just a, it's not to scale, obviously, but it does give you some kind of a visual reference in terms of the size and shape of the different blood cell types. So red blood cells have that characteristic sort of frisbee disc look. And if you have sickle cell anemia, then your red blood cells look sort of like almost, well, like a sickle, like a boomerang sort of, and that affects its ability to carry oxygen. Platelets are really teeny tiny little fragments of cells. And then our white blood cells are the largest of the 3. So they all kind of travel together in our blood vessels in this sort of broth of plasma. So plasma is sort of like a broth to the soup that is blood with all of its constituent parts. Now, from a microscopic perspective, this is what each of these blood cells would look like, right? So we can clearly see that distinctive disc-like shape of the red blood cell, this larger white blood cell with looks like maybe some markers on the surface, and then our smaller platelet. And see the little fibers there? That's going to become important. So take note of that. Okay, so let's break down the different constituent parts of blood. We're going to first talk about plasma. So, if you had to look at this picture and say, well, what would you say about plasma? What do you already know about it? So obviously it would be described as a pale yellowish kind of a fluid. And we've already seen that it makes up about 55% of blood volume in total, right? Um, so if you had to guess, well, if that part that it's comprised of, what is it in and of itself made of, right? What is plasma made of? Well, it's a fluid. So I don't think it's a far guess. It's a way out there guess to suggest that it's going to be mostly water, and it is. 92% water, right? It's just that sort of background fluid that allows that carries our blood, other blood cells to the different parts of our body. It's also got some other things in it though. It's got 7% plasma proteins, and I'm going to talk about those plasma proteins a little bit later on because they can also be helpful indicators within your blood if you're getting a blood sample taken. Um, and then also lastly, 1% ions. So those ions here, just a couple of them, sodium, potassium, some bicarbonate as well that we see in our blood, all with a different particular function. The bicarbonate will help to balance out pH, but I'm going to get to that in the next slide. So it's possible sometimes for people to receive simply a plasma transfusion, not just a whole blood, but a plasma transfusion for particular purposes. So next, let's talk about function. So the function of our plasma is that, as you would guess, it's going to be carrying nutrients and waste throughout the body. So bringing nutrients to where they need to go, removing wastes from where they were to some way that they can exit the body. So a good example of that would be like urea, which is a nitrogen byproduct from our proteins. Our bodies need to get rid of that. And so our plasma would be carrying that through, and of course CO2. Um, it also helps to maintain blood pH. So, like I was mentioning before, there's bicarbonates within our plasma that help to balance our blood pH. Blood is just slightly alkaline, slightly on the basic side, and so the bicarbonate creates what we call a buffer system to help to maintain pH, and that's located in the plasma of our blood. We also have those plasma proteins that I mentioned. They're different ones and they have different functions, but I'm just going to mention a couple of them. And one of them is globulins. And so globulins are a type of antibody which helps us to fight infection. Um, and fibrinogen. So fibrinogen is going to come into play when we talk about platelets, fibrin specifically. But the fibrinogen is going to be located in our plasma as one of the plasma proteins. Okay, so when people mention blood, first, the type of blood cell that comes to mind is the red blood cell, and that's mainly because blood is red, I think. This year we're going to give it a nice new fancy sciencey name, and that sciencey name is the erythrocyte. We've talked a lot about suffixes and prefixes and their meaning in biology and helping us to kind of make some inferences. So the suffix "cyte" refers to cell. Okay, so you're going to see that suffix in a lot of the different slides today. So a cytologist might study cells. So erythrocytes, what is their structure? So as we've already seen, they make up about 44% of blood volume, and this is, really typically speaking. Their main, they have um, no nuclei or organelles, interestingly enough. And what they contain are these molecules called hemoglobin. And the job of hemoglobin we're going to talk about more extensively in the next slide. But mostly what we need to think about with hemoglobin is that they are this molecule that is oxygen carrying and also iron rich. It's an iron molecule that requires iron in its primary structure. It's a protein that we have about, each of our red blood cells actually has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules. So think about that for a second. Each red blood cell is going to live about 120 days, and then it's going to cease to be functional, and it will die off. But where do the new red blood cells get made? Well, they get produced in our bone marrow. So there you have it. So let's talk about the function of red blood cells. Red blood cells primarily are going, and by the way, RBC, red blood cells, um, to basically to carry oxygen. And it's an interesting thing because hemoglobin actually um, uh, likes oxygen, but it also likes carbon monoxide. And it actually likes carbon monoxide, the poisonous gas that kills you. It will prefer that to oxygen, or kind of like be either or. So that's the mechanism by which carbon monoxide kills us, is because carbon monoxide will attach to our hemoglobin, be traveling around our body and depriving our body, specifically our brain, of the necessary oxygen that it needs. Okay, so oxygen-rich red blood cells are going to be bright red. That's why, when we're looking at a circulatory system diagram, the oxygenated components are usually in red. Oxygen-rich red blood cells are actually dark red, though in diagrams they're often depicted as blue. Right? So when you see blood out of your body, typically it's going to be, you're going to see a difference in color from when it's inside your body for that reason. Okay, so deficiency in red blood cells or hemoglobin is called anemia, and you can get anemia for a variety of reasons, one of which is if you have an iron deficiency, and that would be called iron deficiency anemia. We see that with, women of childbearing age, often just because of their menstrual cycles, they're losing blood volume, and so they'll often appear pale and will be fatigued, as you would expect. Fewer red blood cells equals less oxygen transported to your body equals fatigue, right? Loss of energy, because oxygen is needed as a main material, as a reactant in cellular respiration, which is the process by which we gain energy. So no oxygen equals no cellular respiration equals no energy. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, here what we have, again, is just showing you the large white blood cell compared to our red blood cell traveling in that soup of plasma. We're going to give our white blood cell a fancy name, though. Again, red blood cells are erythrocytes. White blood cells are leukocytes. And so that prefix leuko may be familiar to you if you've heard of leukemia, which is a blood cancer, right? So there's that connection. So let's talk about the structure of white blood cells. First off, as you'll remember from that diagram that I showed you at the beginning of this slide show, they make up a very small percentage of our blood, typically speaking. However, um, you know, if you will remember from last year, white blood cells, we tend to associate them with fighting infection. They have other purposes, but fighting infection. And so if you do get sick, the volume of white blood cells in your blood sample will actually increase, and that actually is often a marker of illness. Is just an interesting proportion or a larger than normal proportion of white blood cells in your blood sample. They're colorless, and as we mentioned before, they're larger than our red blood cells. But, having said that, they still are small enough to squeeze through the tiny pores in the walls of our blood vessels, kind of like, oh, this was supposed to be a GIF. Arg, not sure what's going on here, but these little white blood cells can go through the walls of our blood vessels to go to specific regions in our body to access them and to fight infection there. So there we have it. Okay, oh, I'm really happy that this one worked. So in this little animation, I want you to see these little tiny creatures here. There's one over here. There's one over, right, these things. And so this moving cell is a white blood cell. And what those little black things that it's engulfing are bacteria. And so you can see here that our white blood cells are actively engulfing that bacteria, because that bacteria could potentially be a threat to the organism that it's invading. All right, so what's the function of our white blood cells? They're basically to defend the body. But they do that through a process called phagocytosis. So that is basically what that means in short term is just engulfing of larger chunks of things. That's a concept or a topic that we will explore in greater detail in grade 12 biology. Right now, all you need to know is that phagocytosis basically just means enveloping and engulfing. All right. So they're going to also clean up dead cells and foreign material. So if you've ever had a cut and that cut somehow becomes infected, then you'll often see some pus that's there, and that pus is just dead cells that have been cleaned up by your white blood cells. Now, also some of our white blood cells, some of our leukocytes are going to form antibodies and act to defend us against illness, future and prevent future illness. And we're seeing that right now with the vaccine that's coming out for COVID-19, right? So our white blood cells are going to be aiding in that specific function. Now, I want to talk just really briefly about the different types of white blood cells because often people think of white blood cells as being a singular entity, but there are different types of white blood cells with their different functions. So neutrophils are the largest in number. Most of our white blood cells count's going to be neutrophils. And they're the ones that are going to go off and fight any kind of foreign invaders like a bacteria, like a virus. Next we have these eosinophils, and they're basically they line our respiratory tract, and so in they're really prominent there, and their job in that function is to essentially just fight off allergens, right? As you can, I mean, it kind of makes sense if they're in our respiratory tract and we're breathing in materials that are going to cause an allergy, it would make sense that the eosinophils would be there. Now, next also are the basophils. Basophils are interesting because they secrete some material out of their cell, and what that does is it kind of sends a signal to the phagocytes, and phagocytes are cells that basically just engulf other things and destroy them. So the basophils are known for secreting material that will actually just kind of do that, which is kind of cool. So lymphocytes are going to fight infections by producing antibodies. And our monocytes just have the job of cleaning up dead cells, right? So just engulfing them and cleaning them by that mechanism. So some interesting, just variety of white blood cells to think about, each with their sort of different job, as it were. Okay, so next I want to talk about platelets. Platelets this year, we're going to give them a fancy sciencey name. They're called thrombocytes. And so let's just take a look at this little animation here for a second. What do we see? So we see what appears to be an open wound. And then here are that characteristic shape of the platelet that we see, and it appears that it's kind of like arriving at the site of injury and sort of creating almost like these like little webs coming out of them. So what is their structure? Well, in terms of how many we have about one platelet for every 20 red blood cells. And what are they? Well, in terms of their structure, they're just little kind of small little fragments of larger cells. They don't have their own nucleus, so they're pretty simple. But they're surrounded by membranes that are going to create these little fibers they'll expand upon. And I'm going to talk about that in the next section. But as with our red blood cells, they're produced by the bone marrow. Okay, so now how do they work? What is their function? Their function, obviously, platelets cause blood clotting, but here we're seeing a blood clot happening in action. This nice animation here. Now, so what do you see? You see these platelets kind of landing on the wound site, but they're not just landing on the wound site. They're also kind of, activating these fibers that extend from them that seem to be trapping these larger red blood cells from escaping. And so that's essentially how a blood clot forms. So their job is to initiate blood clotting. when a platelet membrane is going to be ruptured, it releases this substance that causes, it's like Spider-Man almost, this mesh of fibers to form. And that those fibers are comprised of fibrin. And what those fibers do is it creates like a mesh around the wound and traps the other larger cells, specifically red blood cells, from being able to move anywhere, and that creates that clot. Now, before we finish off here, I wanted to remind you about the genetic disorder that we talked about in our genetics unit, which was hemophilia. And so hemophilia, one of the big issues with and concern if you have that genetic disorder is that your blood will not clot. And so there's issues with platelets and their ability to form clots. And so you would just sort of bleed um, without any ability to form natural clots. And so you would have to have these clotting factors as a supplement. So just for your interest, I thought you might want to see what these fibrin fibers look like that create that mesh that prevent our red blood cells from passing through. And so eventually, that will cause your red blood cells will form like that scab, and then over time it'll just kind of dissolve away. That's it for this screencast. Just remember the four components of blood, work on learning their sciencey names, their structure, and their function, and you should be good to go. And as always, make sure you reach out with any additional questions that you might have, and I'll be happy to help you out.